bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
I mean, quite a few of them died. I think there were the three astronauts on Apollo 1, Chaffee, Grissom, and White, died because of...
That's putting it mildly. Died mildly. That's putting it very mildly.
They were basically incinerated in pure oxygen under pressure. Of course, it's going to explode.
Yeah.
That's incompetence in my book.
Yeah.
Neglect. It would appear to have been a deliberate action to silence, because Gus Grissom was getting very vocal about the improbability of being able to land on the moon. As he said at the time, we can't even communicate between two buildings here on Earth.
Exactly. And I put this in my first book, and I was so furious when I read this.
Yeah.
I actually read this from an author, proponent of the Apollo missions. And when he's talking about Apollo 1, the Apollo 1 tragedy, which incinerated those three astronauts, three souls, right? He actually said, and I couldn't believe this. I mean, you're going to defend NASA, but don't appeal to the reader. Don't treat the reader like they're idiots, okay? Because most readers out there are smart, all right? He actually said, it was only afterwards that NASA realized the potential dangers of pressurizing the cabin of space capsule with pure oxygen.
No, it wasn't.
You telling me that NASA didn't know the dangers of an overpressurized cabin with using pure oxygen? They didn't know?
Of course they did.
Message to NASA, if you didn't know that, get out of the business you're in right now, because we don't want you there.
Good point.
You know, but really, it's mind-boggling that people come out with statements like that.
Yeah.
And then there was other statements from other authors, like, it's amazing that NASA didn't get hit with any solar flares or coronal mass ejections or any micrometeorites. It was a miracle that they made it back in one piece, but the missions happened.
It's the luck of Apollo that they weren't zapped by a coronal mass ejection.
And that is when they went at the height of the height of sun activity from 68 or 69 to 72.
Yeah.
That was the height of solar activity in terms of producing solar flares, solar storms. The height.
Yep.
Right? Yep. Just amazing.
Wait, just one point to add on the Apollo 1 tragedy. Gus Grissom's widow, Betty Grissom, and her son, Gus's son, Scott Grissom, were not willing to accept the explanation that had been given, and they wanted to examine the command module in which his father and husband had died. Now, Scott Grissom was at the time a 747 airline pilot, so he knew what science was about. He knew what engineering was about. Betty Grissom was particularly concerned that members of the intelligence services had come to the house just after the capsule caught fire without telling her what had happened, and removed some of Gus Grissom's work. He was writing reports on the inadequacy of Apollo and removed it. Scott Grissom was able to gain access to the module and examined it in detail, and found what he claimed was a device within the capsule which would ensure a short circuit, i.e. a spark, which would ignite the oxygen. So he claimed that his father was murdered, and he's never retracted that.
So he found the trigger.
Basically found the trigger, something that would ignite the atmosphere in which they were sitting. So,
and that's a subject that makes the proponents very uneasy. They don't like talking about it when you bring up Gus Grissom's son.
I know, Scott Grissom, a brave man.
Scott Grissom, yeah.
He's a very brave man, because he went public with his findings. He insisted on going public, which implied that it was a premeditated action.
Yeah.
Now, a 747 pilot is highly trained. He knows what he's doing. He knows about.
For sure.
These are people you take notice of if they say something.
Well, I know from my own training as a pilot, flying single engine and twin engine props, I have a very a very good idea what, and I haven't flown jets, I haven't gone to that level, but I have a very, very good idea of the work that's involved to get to the level of captain for a 747 or a pilot, a co-pilot for a 747. It's it's an incredible piece of machinery, and you have to know what you're doing flying it. You learn a lot. I know I have a friend who's a pilot as well, and he was flying. He's an instructor. He doesn't like the airline business. He got out of it, but when he was flying, he went overseas and he had a contract to fly Dash 7s. A Dash 7, to give people an idea, is about a 50 or 60 seater. It's a 4-propeller driven aircraft, turboprop. It's a nice airplane itself. And he was saying that just learning to fly that, he thought he knew everything. Stepping up from where he was to fly the Dash 7. He thought he knew everything there was to learn in aviation. He was wrong. He says there was so much more to learn. So you take a step from that up to a 747.
Yeah.
Right. So that gives gives everyone a really good picture of what's involved. So yes, Gus Grissom would know what he's talking about.
Yeah. Well, Scott Grissom.
Scott Grissom would know what he was talking about.
Yeah. And
yeah,
he was adamant, and Betty Grissom has maintained that as well, because he would have believed her son. You know, if your husband dies under those sort of circumstances, you want to find out what happens.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
To actually get access to the Apollo 1 command module in which he died took a great deal of pressure.
Yeah.
And I think his senator helped him get it. It's still around. It's still there. It's kept out of sight in a warehouse somewhere on NASA, probably in Langley, Virginia. Well,
there's a lot of people on the inside, a lot of senators and congressmen and congresswomen that know, I'm sure, fully aware of that story and what's really behind it.
Yeah.
And it's still a black eye on NASA to this day, because even their official narrative makes you just look at them. Wait a minute, how could you not know an overpressurized cabin with pure oxygen would be a problem? And then on the next day, you're telling us you went to the moon and back. I mean, just looking at their official narrative, it just makes you shake your head and say, whoa, hold on a minute here. How could you not know that?
Exactly.
How could they not know that? And why weren't there other safety protocols? I read about that, and I wrote about it in my first book, and I didn't see a lot of safety protocols involved in that launch simulation. I didn't read it. That one thing that's missing too, and I want to bring this out. There was another person that was killed. That was Robert Barron, if I'm saying his name right. Thomas Barron.
Thomas Barron. That's right.
Yeah. And for the viewers, he was on contract from one of the corporations. I'm not sure which one now. That was involved in the command module, if I'm not mistaken.
He was the safety inspector at North American Aviation.
And he wrote a 50-page report. And well, he actually wrote 2 reports. I'll get to that one in a second. He wrote a 50-page preliminary report, and it was a very damning indictment of NASA after the accident. And then he had submitted a 500-page report to Congress, and he had testified. And then shortly after that, he was killed. Him, his wife, and his daughter were killed in a railroad crossing. They were in their car. I mean, that just sounds very peculiar too. A week after he had testified, and his 500-page report disappeared.
Yeah.
And this was all about Apollo 1.
Yeah.
And NASA's practices during that time, and some of the goings on behind the scenes. And it was a very damning report, and that report has disappeared. That 500-page report is gone.
Yeah.
That's fact.
Yeah, it has. And it was known to exist because Thomas Barron talked about it. I mean, you write a 500-page report. It's not something you do over a weekend. It's a lengthy process to produce it. I mean, you've written 500 pages of a book.
Yeah.
You know, the amount of time it would have taken you to do that.
Oh, a lot.
To create a logical, sensible narrative. Thomas Barron would have had a lot of technical detail to cover as well.
Sure. And you would have to put all that into not only gather the information from many, many, many sources, thousands of pages, then
Yeah.
you'd have to break it down into paragraph form and make it into, you'd have to make sure it's coherent for everybody to be able to read, and you have to organize it and write 500 pages. That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot. That's the size of David Percy and Mary Bennett's book.
Yeah. Dark Moon. Yeah. That's 5 pages.
Yeah.
You know, same as you. I mean, you've written over 500 pages.
200 and some pages in my first book and 340 in my second book.
There you go.
Yeah.
And now let me ask you, would you have written that amount of material if Apollo was real?
The quick answer to that is no.
Because during your research, and you spent a lot of time researching this, you would probably have found out at some point, why am I doing this? Apollo was quite real. I can prove it. But you didn't do that. You found it wasn't real. It was a fake. It was a fraud. It was a fabrication.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have devoted that amount of time. David Percy and Mary Bennett, who wrote Dark Moon, would not have done that when they wrote the book 20 years ago. Trevor Weaver's written over 2,000 pages of his 4 books. Bart Sabrell's just published his book, Moon Man, which is a remarkable story.
Yeah.
I mean, some of Bart Sabrell's book reads rather like a thriller. You know, car chases, shadowy agents, having to dash out of cars into other cars.
Make a good movie.
Yeah. Well, it probably will be a movie, and Bart will probably feature it because he's a filmmaker.
Yeah.
But if what Bart did, which was to produce the film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, as a result of receiving from NASA a piece of a roll of film which had a large label on it saying not for public distribution, he found that in all the material, because he asked NASA, he said, I want every photograph, every film of Apollo 11. He was only concentrating on that. And being a filmmaker, he would know what to look for, which he did. And he produced his film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt that NASA faked the Apollo missions because they couldn't get 130,000 miles, which is where they claimed to be when they were photographing the Earth, which was a photograph stuck in the window.
Yeah. They
were in low Earth orbit. Now, if what he was saying was complete nonsense and just a conspiracy theorist gone wild, if that was all it was, nobody would take any notice of him, because all NASA had to do was to come along and say, no, look at this. This is how it happened. This is the reality. They wouldn't send secret agents trying to stop him handing the film over to television companies who were going to transmit it, which is what they did.
Yeah.
Because what Bart Sabrell had found out, what a lot of other people have found out in the meantime by looking at it in the detail at all this, is that Apollo was faked.
Yeah.
It had to be for the reasons we've covered, you know, the Vietnam War, the necessity of America being seen to be successful when they weren't. All that was going on. If that wasn't true, they wouldn't need to send agents chasing after Bart Sabrell, trying to stop him getting this film to a television studio. What they've done now, of course, is to move up a stage and approach the heads of these companies, the broadcasting companies, and have pressured them to ensure that the film is never shown on national television in America.
Yeah.
Of course, you can go and buy a copy of the film and see it yourself, and it's online now.
Well, it's a known fact that most of the major newsrooms in America, and same here in Canada, have either CIA or intelligence operatives working in those newsrooms, and they're very, very instrumental in approving stories that get released. Yeah. And I had read a book several years ago by an insider. Actually, he worked for the UK Guardian, and believe his name was Paul Davies, and he wrote a book called Flat Earth News. And for all the viewers out there, this is not about the flat Earth theory, so let's get that off the table. All right, it's nothing to do with that.
Yeah,
it was about how news is manipulated, and and coming from an insider, and he got the support of the editor of the UK Guardian to write the book. And basically what he said is that there's two main sources of news that come in through North America, and that's Associated Press and Reuters. And he says what happens is when a news item goes through those two sources, the story is checked very carefully, rewritten in a lot of parts, some parts embellished, or in fact, fictional parts written on before it's released to the North American media outlet. And then from the media, it filters down and it gets worked on again before we actually get it on our 6 o'clock news. Yeah. And I'm not surprised that the Apollo missions have not been talked about much in terms of the controversy, not the actual official narrative that's on there all the time, but I'm just not surprised. And what people don't realize is that when we look, and I won't get into this today because I know this could be censored on we don't want any censorship on our video, but with the present war going on right now and all the crap that's going on over there, we don't really know what's going on. We don't. We're getting filtered news that's owned on top of that's owned by 6 major corporations who are benefiting from all of this. So I'm not surprised when people say to me, well, Randy, Marcus, if you had proof of the Apollo missions, why aren't you sending this into CNN? They'd be first to air it. No, they wouldn't. No. They're not going to go near the story about the Apollo missions because JFK, Apollo moon missions, 9/11, the last 2 years, you unravel that. That's the biggest story in the history of mankind. Yeah. They're not going to go near it. They're not going to go near it. Any one of those stories will lead to other conspiracy facts, not conspiracy theories, but conspiracy facts. The moon missions are right up. I was talking to somebody recently who had she had wrote an interesting book about the Beatles and the deception that's going on there. And I thought it was very interesting. I looked into it a little bit, and the more you look at that, that's quite a rabbit hole to go down. But I had told her that I had written a book myself on the Apollo moon missions, and she came back and she says that's an equally important story. Really? She says you expose that one, you expose a lot. Yeah, it's true. It's what you said earlier, Marcus. Yeah, but it ties in with a lot. Like you tied it in with the Vietnam War, and it's a very good the tie-ins and the connections. It just branches out. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. 10 years ago, actually 10 years ago this month, April, I gave a presentation to the British Interplanetary Society, which is a major space advocacy group. Based in London. It's been around for about 90 years now. It's the oldest, longest established space advocacy group, started by Arthur C. Clarke was a prominent member. Patrick Moore's been a prominent member. Anyway, I was invited to present my case for the Apollo missions being faked. And that created what we call now a Twitter storm. Though Twitter wasn't around then, this is 10 years ago. Yeah. And anyway, because I sent, when they asked me to do it, I said, yes, I'll do it. And the person organizing the event was a guy by the name of Jerry Stone. And I said, look, I'll show you what I'm going to talk about. So we met up in a Costa Cafe somewhere in London. And I went through every picture I was going to use in the presentation. So he knew exactly what I was going to say. When it was announced I was going to be speaking, as I say, there was a huge backlash against the British Interplanetary Society. How dare they invite some hoax believer, that's what I am, a hoax believer, in Apollo. Surely if they're going to do this, they should make it a debate, put somebody up against him, so that they can refute what Marcus is going to say. And we can see what an idiot he is. Anyway, that's what happened. Rather than me doing a presentation on my own, they said, right, you do 40 minutes. We'll get somebody to do 40 minutes against you, show how you're wrong, and then we'll have question and answers. Well, Jerry Stone was the person who was going to refute everything I said, and he failed miserably to do it, even though he knew exactly what I was going to be saying and exactly what photographs I was going to be using.
In the question and answer session afterwards, he said, well, why didn't you refute what Marcus said, Jerry? And he said, well, I thought I did. And he said, no, you didn't. You just gave the presentation you give to school kids about how wonderful NASA is. That's not a refutation. And at the end of it, several people came up to me privately and said, I think you're right. I can see that, I can see what you're talking about. I can see why you say it. So thanks for that. But no thanks to Jerry. Jerry will not speak to me now.
Really?
Yeah. He won't debate with me. And there's another chap I got tangled up with, a guy called Peter Bassett, who's written a book about how wrong we all are.
Oh, Peter Bassett. Yeah, he's an interesting character, isn't he, that man? Piece of work.
Piece of work. Anyway.
But I want to back up for a second with your that interview, that presentation you gave. The proponents are really bothered by that. They talk about that. That's going back 10 years, right?
Yeah, 10 years.
Proponents do not like that. When that's brought up, they take you out of context.
I know.
And they try to use that to prove, well, Marcus admitted that he wasn't that the Apollo missions were real. I always come back and say, well, why don't you watch it again? And because you're taking him out of context, right? They do not like the fact that you were in a room full of professionals on your own, that you took them all on.
Yeah.
And they don't like that. And they do their best to belittle you and ridicule you, but it just doesn't stand up. It doesn't work. And speaking of Peter Bassett, I had some interesting going back and forth with him on one of my YouTube videos a while ago. And then when I challenged him, I got fed up with him, actually. I challenged him to an online debate and he refused.
Yeah. Well, same with me. I suggested I went to the astronomy club that he is a leading member of down in Kent. I said, look, I'll come down and I'll present my case and you can tear me to pieces if you can. We can let the members decide. He said, no, I'm not inviting somebody who's obviously not fully aware of what they're talking about. So
all the more reason why you can make your point. If you had that, if he really believes that, then he would have no qualms about discussing this. And I wasn't even going to debate. I'll just say, let's have a discussion. Let's do a Skype discussion and we'll post it and let the viewers decide.
Exactly.
Like a wrecking ball going back and forth